The Citicorp Center, a dynamic loading case study. In the early 1960s, Citicorp Group had outgrown their current office located across the street from St. Peter's Lutheran Church. They decided to retain the services of Hugh Stubbins and Le Mercier, a structural engineer of the time, to design a new structure that could accommodate all the space that they had needed. They started to acquire land across the street from St. Peter's Lutheran Church and on that entire block. Due to the nature of the contracts in which they created to purchase the land, there were no loads allowed to be transmitted from any structure they built down onto the church below, which was being renovated. So when Hugh Stubbins and Le Messier met in the early 1970s, he decided to meet at a Greek restaurant down in Lower Manhattan, and while they discussed their plans, Le Messier drew out the chevron truss structure shown here. This structure allowed for the columns not to be installed on the corners of the building as was typical, and the chevron design helped transfer the loads to the columns and into the foundation below without disturbing that St. Peter's Church. The feature at the top was intended to be residential terraces, however, due to zoning laws, it was converted to mostly mechanical room and room for the tuned mass damper, which was needed for the steel structure due to its overall lightweight and unconventional foundation and lower structural design. When a Princeton student began her thesis back in the 1970s, she decided to do it on the Citicorp Center and its impact on the surrounding neighborhoods. She contacted a local junior engineer who worked for Le Messier, and he provided the calculations and design intent from their firm. While she was reviewing this for her thesis, she discovered there was a flaw in their design methodology. Although it followed the code of the time and AISC's code regarding the loadings and reduced loadings on truss members, she saw that the quartering winds produced the greatest amount of force on the structure and therefore needed to be re-reviewed and probably a new design created. She brought this design flaw to that junior engineer's attention, who, because he worked for the design team, quickly assured her that everything was fine and that he would look into it, but that there was nothing to worry about. Luckily, this junior engineer decided to contact Le Messier and must have done this at some point near to his meeting with Hartley, because Le Messier at first decided that he had analyzed this enough and that it must have been an anomaly. But while he was on a business trip in Pittsburgh in which he was developing some steel structures there with some tuned mass dampers, the structural steel contractor asked him in that situation as well if he could redesign the building so that instead of having fully welded connections to have bolted connections. This jogged Le Messier's memory, and he decided that he needed to reanalyze the Citicorp Center's structure because during the course of the construction there was a deduct given for the welded connections to be converted to bolted connections. He ended up going to Maine to his vacation home to study this all weekend, and while he reanalyzed this, he determined there was a serious issue. His project team had allowed for the bolted connections to be designed and installed. However, they only accounted for, or they did not account for the diagonal truss. They did not account for the diagonal members to be treated as columns, but instead trusses. And AISC code at the time allowed the dead load to be reduced to 0 for truss members in the diagonal position that they were, as opposed to columns in which it would have only been a 3/4 reduction. This resulted in 40% more loading due from the quartering winds that would occur on the structure during any 16-year storm or great wind event. Upon figuring this out, he decided to formulate a solution immediately and present all his findings to the design team and ownership. He famously once stated that you cannot just cause havoc without having a solution. So he wanted to go to Stubbins and Citicorp's chairman with a solution before, while also alerting them to the seriousness of the issue. On the morning of July 31st, 1978, LeMessier contacted Hugh Stubbins and Chairperson Ritson from Citicorp Center. They discussed how the issue had come about, why there was an issue, and how LeMessier had designed a fix for it already. All they needed was Citicorp's chairman to give them the go-ahead, as well as the design architect Hugh Stubbins to okay the fix, and they were good to go. LeMessier contacted an old ally in the industry in Carl Co-Correcting and was able to muster enough manpower needed to complete the remedial fix on time and also complete on off hours so as not to expose this issue to the media and cause undue panic. The remedial fix was to install 6-foot long by 2-inch thick gusset plates at every connection that needed to be welded, and this was done during the night mostly and also off hours during the day. The project overall was very fortunate because there was an impending hurricane which was set to hit South Carolina, and the team had needed to get the work done before this storm could possibly turn north. Co-Correctors was able to complete the work with minimal media distraction. Not until the New York Times report 17 later was anybody even aware that this was an issue. And the funny thing about it is that Diane Hartley herself did not even know that a fix had been designed, or that there was, or that the issue that she had brought up was even addressed with the project team, and that she was correct in her assumptions. LeMessier is now reveled not only as a capable structural engineer in designing a first of its kind tune mass damper, but also a figure that made the right ethical choice despite the risk to himself and his career. Another note on this tune mass damper is that it could have withstood and helped out during the 16-year storm or 50-year storm with the bolted connections. There was not a serious issue with the building actually going to fail, at least in these areas where it had the highest stresses. But since this was a computer controlled mechanism, if the power did go out, then there was the danger that the building would fail. So one of the first things the chairperson did actually was to buy 4 large generators and install those before co-correctors even started the remedial fix. Therefore, if the storm did hit, they would be able to run the damper on a generator and the building would be able to withstand the storm. In all, the project and the public was saved from potential disaster due to Diane Hartley notifying LeMessier's team and LeMessier's actions. Things that you can learn from this is that non-typical structures subject to dynamic loading should be analyzed to a higher degree. And nowadays, most tall structures, most super talls, most certainly, have a model created and for a wind tunnel, so that the theory can be verified, the calculations can be verified. Changes during the construction process also must be analyzed just as well to determine the possibility without affecting design intent. Lots of times there's great ideas during the construction process on how to get the project done faster or more safe, or not exposing certain items to the elements, but in all, most of these decisions can affect things much further down the road, and need to be analyzed by the entire team, especially the lead engineer on the project.